once again to Talking Point. I'm Mayor Mike, and my guest today is our new Neighborhood Improvement Coordinator, Mark Kordus. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
So the Neighborhood Improvement Coordinator is a position that was derived as part of our inspection department, taking into account the little property maintenance codes that are often overlooked, probably not known about real well, and your job is to make people aware that these ordinances exist and to try and get compliance. So when you were hired, you came from a different kind of background. Why don't you talk a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and
Sure.
tell us a little bit about the background and where you came from.
Sure. Yeah, my background, I do have municipal experience, but that was early on in my career. Right out of college, I worked for the village, at the time it was the town of Weston. They were in the process of incorporating the village of Weston. It was a good opportunity to work for at the time, smaller municipality of about 10,000 people. I think they've grown to around 16 or 17,000 now, but they're going through a lot of growing pains. So I got a lot of different experience in different aspects of municipal government, from planning, zoning, inspection, engineering, water, sewer, just about everything.
Good.
Then I worked in planning and zoning for Lincoln County, doing very similar type things, enforcement activities primarily, but then also doing some writing of code and things like that. After that, I'd worked 4 years for a private real estate development firm, so I kind of got that aspect of it. I got a real estate broker's license at that time or shortly thereafter, and I've kept that broker's license up. And then prior to coming here, I worked 9 years for a private consulting firm, a very large publicly owned firm out of Canada. Done a lot of work for development projects, natural resource projects, grant writing for municipalities. Most notably worked with the city of Wiza and helped them obtain grants for the East Riverfront development, which is underway right now.
Good.
And lastly, I think the one thing that is somewhat unique, I'm also a landlord. I own about 8 rental units myself, so I do understand some of the challenges that landlords have with tenants.
Good. And, and it's not just about rental properties. It's really about all of our properties, owner-occupied or otherwise. And just some of the things that the community has decided through our ordinances we want to see almost philosophically. And getting compliance with those. Some of the things that I know are relatively common are cutting your grass or maintaining your lawn frequently, whether that's a natural lawn or a prairie grass type area. Talk a little bit about some of those things.
Yeah, so, well, just to take a step back from that and maybe a broader perspective, our ordinance is quite old. It was written in, I think, the early 70s. Yeah, 73. Yeah. There are several things that need to be updated. Actually, our goal is to update those over the course of the summer with adoption sometime in the fall.
Right.
As part of that, we're actually undergoing a community-wide survey to gauge the interest of people within the community as to what they deem acceptable and non-acceptable. So one thing you had mentioned is, routine code violations. Grass is one. I would say a very common one everywhere in the city of Stevens Point is people parking on the grass with their cars.
And that is not allowed by ordinance.
That is not allowed by ordinance. A lot of people don't realize that. So, things like that. Should parking on the grass be allowed, or should rather than just looking at things from an enforcement perspective, I don't think it's our duty as a municipality to make things worse for people.
I agree.
Let's take the example of the parking on the grass, and you have, especially in the old downtown core area near campus, numerous properties that have been converted to duplex or rooming houses. When those houses were built, essentially people had one car, and now there's 4, 5, 6 cars that need to try to fit in there, and there's just not enough room. So one thing, and it's actually outlined in the survey, and I understand the city council is also considering this, is to allow alternate on-street parking overnight, which, again, it's difficult for me to go out and issue a citation or write a notice of non-compliance to somebody when knowing there really isn't a solution to the problem. So I think part of this is exploring our ordinances, seeing what works, what doesn't work, what the people in the community want to see what's acceptable to them. And then perhaps, because Stevens Point is so diverse, you have the core downtown area, you have newer kind of suburb type development, larger lots that don't have the same issues as you have downtown. So the survey is also broken up based on the overall view of Stevens Point as a city as the whole, but also on a neighborhood basis, because people may consider the issues much different in their neighborhood than they do on the whole, Stevens Point as a city as a whole.
Right. And, it goes deeper than that, too, because it's very difficult to define some of the things that are acceptable and aren't. I use an example. In my neighborhood within 3 blocks of my house, we have RVs, over 24 feet, I would say. I don't know exactly, but less than 30, probably under 24. Very similar in nature. One is stored very responsibly. That person clearly takes care of their property and takes pride in that property. They store it on concrete. They take good care of it. It's in good repair. On the same token, the similar vehicle, in this case the pull behind, is stored off to the side. Mudded ruts, the grass is dead all around it. It's clear that they use this vehicle maybe once or twice a year. They don't take the same pride in it. It's often dirty, not cleaned up. It looks poor. So to say that it's okay to do this for one person but not the other is very hard to define. They are both parked. In this case, one is on a hard surface, the other one is not. But even so, I would say that even if the other one was on a hard surface, the fact that it's not well maintained and it doesn't look good from the road could be problematic, hard to define. If you're having it in the garage or in the backyard, people don't have to see it. The neighbors driving by, walking by, don't see these things. It's less of an issue. But the challenge is getting people to be responsible with their properties. And that's really what it comes down to. I've said this before, that if I could make a law saying everybody needs to be nice to each other and be responsible, we would have no problems. But that's not the case. So our goal is not to slap a citation on people. Our goal is to get compliance. And why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because you've implemented a few things since you've been here that I think are going to go a long way towards that.
Yeah. So I don't believe personally that, and I think one reason I was hired for the position is because of this attitude that government's role should be a big brother or a iron fist.
Right.
In a lot of these cases, College Core, you have tenants that are turned over essentially every year. Are they even aware? I met with a student government association last month as part of their housing fair, and most of the students that were there had already lived off campus. And it was amazing. Most of them were not aware of the regulations that were in place, that they have to shovel their sidewalk. They didn't know that the guy that was out there from the city, a city contractor shoveling their sidewalk, was actually coming out of their security deposit because indirectly their landlord's getting billed for that.
Right.
So education's a big part of it. And as part of that, one thing I did, just kind of as a softer, gentler approach from the city's perspective, and just to let people know more as a courtesy notice, is we developed these pink sticky notes. And on there is just our major violations, grass, weeds, as you mentioned, maybe construction activity without a permit, vehicle parking on the lawn, garbage cart is left out at the curb all week, things like that. We just put their name and their address on there. I notate what the problem is, and usually leave them a little, just a friendly note.
Making them aware of it.
Yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. Please, just push your garbage cart back to the house within 24 hours. Go back, and I've been checking on these. We've been getting about 50% compliance. So
nice.
On the front side, it creates maybe a little bit more work for us as staff, but we're out every day doing inspections, and a lot of these complaints are in similar areas that we're routinely patrolling or getting other complaints. So we've been getting about 50% compliance. And again, I think it's been received much better within the community. It's not, I'm getting this notice of violation from the city, and it's just a more of a nudge than a kind of sledgehammer to let them know as to what they may be violating.
Because that really is the goal. Education and awareness is going to go a long way to helping those people understand what the community hopes they do.
Sure.
You mentioned garbage cans. I wanted to point that out because I recently got a call about it. When the garbage cans are placed outside, you have arms that come by and pick them up. They're automatic arms controlled by a joystick. we want them to be about 4 feet apart.
Okay.
We need a few feet on each side for clearance to get that arm in there. So don't put it right next to the telephone pole. Don't put it next to the other garbage can or the recycling bin. Allow a couple of feet on either side of that bin so the arm can come in there, and it makes it a lot easier for our drivers too. They don't have to be quite as precise with that joystick movement of the arm. And I got a complaint about that recently because their garbage wasn't picked up because the cans were too close together and they couldn't get the arm in there.
Okay.
We tell our drivers, our goal with those mechanical arms is to reduce the amount of manhandling that needs to be involved with those carts and reduce our injuries, our workman's compensation claims. And we've been very successful with that. So we tell our drivers that it's discretionary whether or not they pick it up, but our goal is to reduce those claims. So they're told not to move the cans because then the owner doesn't know that they were, they had a problem. So they leave a sticker on there that just says, hey, your cans were too close together and I didn't pick it up. It's not being mean and we didn't want to pick up your garbage that day, but if we just moved them every time, you would never know that you need some corrective actions. So that's what those stickers are designed for. And that's the same thing you have going here. It works out real good.
Yeah, and just to build off that, once they go from the curb to the building, because this is something we get a fair amount of complaints about, and I realize times have changed with not just having a small individual garbage can anymore. It's, now you have the recycling, you have the garbage, and if it's a duplex, you have 4 of them to deal with or more, depending on the number of people habitating a structure. They have to be stored near the building and beyond that front plane. They can be stored outside, they just need to be stored beyond that front plane or the closest part of the building. They have to be stored at or beyond that line. Okay. So that's something. And again, to go back to that survey, almost everything you've brought up so far, Mike, is really in that survey, and it's things we're trying to gauge public interest on. Is it okay to park RVs on the lawn? And if it's okay, is it okay to park them in the front or the side or the back? Where's appropriate? What's an appropriate all-weather surface? Is it concrete? Is it blacktop? Is it both? Is gravel okay?
Permeable bricks?
Yeah, so these are all questions we've outlined in the survey. Should we limit the amount of impervious surface on a lot? I mean, many municipalities have adopted ordinances like that. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't, but I feel it's important to gauge the interest of the community, as well City Council, Mayor. I'm sure when you're looking at adopting these ordinances, these survey results are going to be very important. In a previous job, again, worked as a private consultant and worked on several new ordinance implementations, and these were primarily for lake districts. They were dealing with, water use activities and things like that were pretty restrictive, and we got a very good turnout at these meetings, and it usually involved DNR and a warden and things like that. But the one thing I learned was it was very easy for these district boards to look at the survey results because they usually weren't 50-50. It was usually pretty well skewed. But on top of that, and there was one in particular that sticks to my mind. It's something that's fairly new. It's called wake surfing, where a special boat's used in a wake is created about 8 to 10 feet tall.
Really?
And it's causing a lot. It was causing a lot of erosion on this lake. So they're looking at regulating it. Well, there was 2 people that lived on the lake that participated in this, but when we sent out the survey, it was about 90% of the people were against this type of activity, but the 2 people that showed up brought all their friends, so it seemed like there was a lot of support for this type of activity on the lake, when in actuality the survey results were dramatically different. So it kind of takes a little bit of that skew out of things. You may have a couple of people that show up at a meeting, they're very vocal about something, but in general, when you look at the results from a community basis, you may see a much different picture.
So the survey is important, like I said, you get a feel for the questions, but then as you're driving around, take note of what you find appealing and acceptable and what you don't, and why, because it's important that we make these rules to address the concerns, but we don't harm the responsible property owners at the same time, like we were talking about with the 2 RVs. Almost identical situations. One was very well cared for, the other one clearly was not. And making a rule, an ordinance that addresses the concern without penalizing the responsible property owner can be challenging sometimes.
Very much so, and my first job, I worked with a building inspector that I won't use his exact language, but he had the philosophy if you had an equal number of people that were satisfied with what you were doing and unsatisfied, that you're probably doing a good job.
Yeah.
I mean, ideally, you want to treat everybody fair.
That's the key.
And sometimes, looking at those properties as you've described, that's a challenge for us because we can't regulate cleanly. That's a very difficult thing. And it's just like walking into one person's house versus another person's house. And what one person deems to be clean and acceptable, another person may not deem to be clean and acceptable. So this is will be written with a pretty broad brush stroke. And I do have experience in not only writing ordinances, but enforcing ordinances. And I think enforcement experience is very important because there's planners that write ordinances that are almost impossible to enforce because they get so specific that the situation you described, it's sometimes so specific that even somebody that's trying to do their best to comply may not comply with something like that. So we want a certain amount of wiggle room in there for people. And again, we don't want to be that big brother. But in situations where you have properties that are unkept, not maintained well, it drags down the value of the neighborhood, and it ends up being an overall drain on the neighborhood itself.
Well, let's take a moment and talk about some of the frequently asked questions, I guess, if you will, using some of this to help educate some of the citizens that are watching or listening.
Yeah.
What are the common ones that you see?
I would say, well, first of all, I want to say another thing that's available on our website, and it's available in our office in City Hall. It's just a trifold brochure. It has the most common questions, about parking, garbage cans, as you had mentioned, occupancy. Some of it's tenant related, and exterior maintenance, it's required as far as snow removal.
And this is available online in the form of a PDF at stevenspoint.com. We also have it at City Hall in the form of a pamphlet where we'll be working with property owners and really anyone who wants one. It's a good tool for landlords to hand out to their tenants. Students at the beginning of the year, new property owners. As a matter of fact, there was someone new that just moved into my neighborhood or will be moving in early May. I'm going to take one. I had always made a habit of introducing myself, letting them know when garbage day is, and some of the general things that this brochure provides. So talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so the brochure is a great starting point, and it kind of ties into your question, which I don't think I really answered, regarding commonly violated ordinances that maybe people don't even realize they're violating.
Right.
I would say one is as long as your trash is within your container, it's fine. But if you leave the trash bags outside, you can't leave trash bags of recycling or trash outside the trash container it's designed to be in. I would say that's a pretty big one. And it's one that makes the neighborhood appear unsightly very, very quickly. Mowing of grass and snow and ice removal on sidewalk. I'd say that's a big one in the winter. People only have 24 hours to remove the snow and ice.
24 hours after the snowfall stops.
After snowfall stops. 48 hours if they're along a boulevard area, which would mean the sidewalk goes right up to the curb and there's no boulevard present.
Right. And the reason we do that, in part, is because the snowplows have to clear the road from the snow. Very likely, as it's Wisconsin. Everybody deals with these problems. I deal with them too. You get done shoveling your sidewalk and the plow comes through and throws some more snow back on. So we afford those property owners that don't have a boulevard a little more time to make sure that they're able to clear it after the plow truck comes through.
Correct. And that's a pretty common one, especially as the city of Stevens Point, in the rental areas, but then also in the non-rental areas. There's just been several new street reconstruction projects that have happened. And as part of that, sidewalk was installed with new curb and gutter. And it's really interesting driving through those neighborhoods. I don't think people realize because they have this new sidewalk that they need to shovel it. Right. So I would say that's something we see very commonly in the winter time. The parking of vehicles on the grass is a big one. I would say the other thing is unlicensed vehicles or inoperable vehicles in the driveway. I think, even if it's on a impervious surface, it has to be operational and or licensed.
Currently registered and licensed.
Correct. Yeah. So Those are probably the bigger ones.
Spring is in the air, of course. So everything that Mother Nature left over the snowfall. I know we have dogs, and try as hard as we can to keep up with the dogs when we let them outside.
Sure.
In spring, you're always going to find a few piles that you missed. It's important that you clean that up for health reasons. But raking your yard, branches, debris, garbage, those things are now very evident now that the snow is gone. So yard maintenance, I think, is a big one.
Sure.
Making sure that your grass is cut, that it's not infested with weeds.
Yep.
If there's trash that happened to be left over in spring, you need to pick those things up, right?
Yeah, and actually one other thing I'll mention that we've run into this just occasionally, but it does seem to be maybe a little bit more prevalent, feeding of animals, which has become a little bit of a problem recently. We have people actively feeding animals that would draw in deer and turkeys in the city, but then also rodents, squirrels, mice, rats, things like that. And so that isn't allowed. I mean, anything like that would draw in, rodents or undesirable creatures is not allowed in the city. And again, it's something we haven't seen a lot of, but we're starting to see a little bit more of it in certain areas. We've received complaints from several neighbors about that. It's something we're starting to see now as spring starting to come out, and people are starting to do those sorts of things.
Well, good. Part of your job, and a big part of your job, as we had said earlier, compliance is the goal. So what we're looking for are ways to help people who need that help. Now, rental properties is a little bit different because that's a business, so they should be able to maintain their business. But individual property owners who live in houses may not have the means or the ability to do some of these things. Elderly, disabled, low income, things like that, where they may need major work done to their house, shingles or soffit, fascia, siding, those sorts of things. Our goal is not to just keep beating them down with ordinance violations, but to find help, and that's a large part of your job. Talk a little bit about some of the programs that you've been exploring and opportunities potentially that you've been exploring in regards to getting some assistance for these people.
Yeah, so the options are unfortunately limited, and I'll start at a higher level and maybe work my way down. One thing I've run into, and you mentioned it, Mike, was the city historically in this position has just sent out ordinance violations and then fine, and I'm looking through some of these old cases, and we've issued $1,000 of fines, and that's not an exaggeration.
It's not going to help anybody, right?
But yeah, ultimately they're still not compliant. So I'm stuck 3 or 4 years later with the same case. The person has $1,000 worth of fines, and the problem's still there. So, and I'll use an example. Just happened a few weeks ago. I followed up on this one, a number of fines, and then they'd actually been issued a citation, went to court. Well, the people didn't show up. They're very elderly. And the lady called me and she says, "I'm surprised I got a letter from you." She said, "We paid all our fines. I thought we were taken care of." And I said, "Well, no, you still have to clean up." And her husband had collected, like bikes and things like that. He used to work on them, and now he's so elderly that he can't. I mean, it's accumulated in front of their garage. And so in that particular case, it's something actually the city is looking at. I've talked to the city attorney, and what would happen in a situation like that, if somebody really wanted the city to help them, they could potentially sign a release that the city would go out and procure through a competitive process a contractor to go in there that would do the work, and they would pay that contractor. And if that contractor didn't get paid, it would ultimately get put on their property tax.
Right, special assessment.
Yes, a special assessment. It's not ideal, but we have people that are elderly. Our experience is there's some people out there that are quote unquote handymen that maybe just take these people's money and don't, and still the problem isn't corrected. Right. So some of these people are genuinely looking for help, and we want to try to help them. To get back to your other question on what's available, we're trying to work within community groups within the city of Stevens Point.
Volunteer groups.
Yes, absolutely. There is some money potentially available. I've been talking to Michael Ostrowski, the Community Development Director, about the potential of looking at some sort of matching grant program, like a 50-50 grant program. I know in the past the city has had some money available, and that's it really hasn't been a grant. I think it's just money that has been given out on a kind of, I'm not going to say as needed basis.
Right. We've had a few programs over the years for neighborhood improvements. There was a house painting program a few years back, tree planting, facade improvements that we've done. All of those things have been available. Money is tight, just like it is for everyone else. But we've got a lot of community organizations, volunteer groups that are always looking for projects, and part of your job is to help coordinate those. So if somebody's looking for a community service project, you've got a list.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say this, again, our job, my job, is not to make their life more difficult. I think anybody that has come in and talked to me will say that I'm really trying to work with them in finding solutions. And that solution may not happen overnight. But we also want to see progress from the person that we're working with. So it is a two-way street. We're willing to work with those people. And if they do have an issue, a problem, please come and see us. I will mention, we talked about a grant program just for briefly, something that happened on the local level. Having worked as a consultant, I had the ability to work in Hennepin and Ramsey County, which is the metro area of Minneapolis-St. Paul. And they both have programs like that in place. And they've found, they've kind of went down the same road Stevens Point did. They first had a program where they just give money out to people that were in need of it. But then when they went to a 50-50 kind of grant match program, they found much more owner investment because the owner was invested in the project. They would live there longer. They would have more ownership in the property and in the project at the end of the day. So that was kind of their recommendation.
Good. Well, I thank you for your time. If someone wanted to get a hold of your office, if they have questions, I know we have our website available, stevenspoint.com. They can find the brochure there. They can find the ordinances there. They can find your contact information there. We'll have those brochures at a couple of places throughout town. And if someone wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch with your office?
Me personally, probably email is the best.
Okay.
And that's Kordus, Kordus, @stevenspoint.com.
Okay.
My direct line is 715-346-1557, I believe, or 54. You may have to edit that.
Yeah, you don't call yourself very often, do you?
No.
All right. Well, I appreciate the time that you've taken to help educate our community and let us know about your job and what you do. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Mayor Mike, and our guest today has been our Neighborhood Improvement Coordinator, Mark Kordus. Until next time, we've been Talking Point.